Pollution kills more people around the world than anything. Whether it's contaminated water or polluted air, the effects are far-reaching. Coal use in China alone results in around 300,000 deaths annually. CO2 and methane emissions contribute significantly to climate change, and with energy consumption increasing across the world, many look for solutions to these problems. The United States, the world's foremost military and economic power, must be a leader in taking on these great challenges. What other types of energy can we use other than fossil fuels? Solar, wind, and hydroelectric energies are clean and safe, but there is one clean and safe source of energy that we often ignore, and there's a reason we do. Nuclear energy has been controversial for decades. Disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima stand out in our minds. American culture is filled with nuclear negativity. From the nuclear power plant frequently on the verge of meltdown in the hit TV show The Simpsons, to films like The China Syndrome, nuclear often gets a bad rap. But what if I told you that nuclear energy is, in fact, the safest type of energy? And what if I told you that nuclear power plants don't actually produce carbon emissions? Well, it's all true. Here with me to discuss this clean and safe type of energy is Russell Langbein. Russell is a retired nuclear warrant officer for the U.S. Navy. He was in the Navy for more than 20 years, operating nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and working in nuclear submarine repair. He has a passion for nuclear power, and he's a great guest for this topic. So, Russell, what exactly is it that makes nuclear power so safe? A lot of people have these misconceptions about nuclear energy being really dangerous and really scary and really frightening. How is it that it's so safe?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing, let's go on to why it's frightening. It's frightening because it's not something that the public in a general sense is educated on. You dealt with a generation coming out of post-World War II who understood a nuclear bomb, and they understood the concept of a nuclear bomb. And as nuclear energy kind of came into play, it seemed, as a common item. There was an easy understanding that, okay, a bomb and a reactor, those are not interchangeable things, but yet that was the way society perceived it. People used to drive to Las Vegas to go watch nuclear testing back in the background, and they would awe at our technological advancements. After the first, real public accident, when 3 Mile Island happened, all of a sudden you're into a public persona that goes, wait a minute, this is different. This is something different than what we saw before. What's not often thought about is it's kind of like talking about a plane crash, right? A car crashes, the number of car crashes that happen every day, people don't necessarily look at the news for that, but if a plane goes down, no one's sitting there going, well, this is how many millions of hours were operated this last month in airplanes compared to cars. Statistically, you're more likely to die in a car crash. When it comes to nuclear power and the safety of nuclear power, what the general public often doesn't look at is the actual safety records in comparison to non-nuclear options. What makes it clean in the sense of, as we're talking about global warming, we're talking about climate change, is the actual operation itself of a nuclear power plant produces pretty much zero carbon emissions. When people see steam, coming out of the stacks that are there and stuff, those are cooling towers for generators. They're not the nuclear reactor itself. All that is water vapor that's coming up. It's not adding to a carbon footprint. The safety mechanism is the inherent safety of the reactors themselves. Most of the catastrophes that we've had, and I use that lightly, if you look at the total number of hours that are operated, and we can throw numbers around there, but they don't really add to the discussion right away. But if you look at the fact that for 7 decades, nuclear reactors have been operating, and we're talking only, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, the sheer number of gigawatts that have been added to the national grid, you're really looking at a safety margin compared to the number of deaths surrounding coal plants, surrounding non-renewable energies that are far less than what you would normally, than anything else. I mean, I don't know if that exactly answers what you're after, but...
Well, I mean, for one thing, just look at China right now. 300,000 deaths associated with with them using coal. So I
Well,
mean,
but when you have coal though, right? So folks understand coal, right? People understand, okay, coal. I burn coal, it creates heat, fire, whatever else, and that boils water, and that water goes off, and turns a turbine. Partly that's a lot of people don't even understand how the coal process even works, and the nuclear process is really no different than the coal process. The difference being here is that instead of actually burning something, what you're doing is you're breaking an atom apart. And when you have an atom, there's a certain amount of energy that's required to hold that atom in its natural state. In this instance, we're talking usually uranium-235. And in the process of fission and the breaking of that atom, that small amount of binding energy that was used to hold the entire uranium atom now is going to be used to hold two smaller atoms together, and those are called fission fragments, or they're fission byproducts. That little bit of remaining energy that was there now is given off. If this happens enough, you generate enough heat that now that water gets hot, it transfers its heat to a secondary system, or sometimes a primary system, creates the same steam, and it goes off and turns a generator. So the power production itself is the same. What is really different is an understanding of how that power is produced.
well, what is it exactly? Because I know we were talking about how clean and safe nuclear energy is. What is it exactly that makes it so safe? Like the plants themselves. I mean, there are not many deaths associated with working on nuclear power plants. What is it that makes it such a safe source of energy?
Well, partially it's the design, right? So you have to be concerned by just taking into consideration what safety margins are required in order just to protect the workers, let's say, that are there. Because I mean, let's face it, the one thing that most people associate in their fear when it comes to nuclear power plants is radiation, the radiation that's being given off. So in the design of the reactor itself, you're concerned with the radiation for the plant workers themselves. That alone creates a safety margin, because if you can protect the workers that are working adjacent to these power plants, then you're obviously protecting the general populace. So those just the general design margins. The safety aspect that I think most people, when they hear safe, is, well, how safe is it when something can melt down? How safe? And it's understanding what a meltdown is. And the reactors can be designed such that meltdowns are not possible. When you look at Chernobyl was a design problem that created the meltdown. When you look at Fukushima was a design problem that created the issue that we're in. 3 Mile Island was a failed relief valve that was really captured fast enough, and there were no real noticeable or recordable effects on the general populace even after those disasters. So I can talk about the design margins of the reactors themselves, but what most people are concerned with is, well, how does it make it safe for me? If I'm living adjacent to a nuclear power plant, how is it safe? Well, it's safe. You're not breathing in any of that radioactivity. You're not breathing in. Everything is contained within. If there is a problem, everything's contained within the design shell of the reactor itself. Again, because by default, you're trying to protect the integrity of the core, to protect the integrity to continue to produce power, to protect the people that are actually working at the plant itself first. Then from that point, then you're worried about the populace around that. So if you take care of one, that usually takes care of the other.
That's a really good and in-depth description of just how safe it actually is. But I think we could also focus on how clean it is. I mean, a nuclear power reactor, it doesn't actually directly emit any carbon dioxide.
Well, so the fission product itself, instead of releasing carbon, any type of carbon, because you're not burning a fossil fuel. You're not even adding to a fossil fuel in a lot of the mining. There's just a glut of uranium already in existence. Obviously uranium comes from mining, but uranium is a fairly, in its general terms, was fairly common to find. There's even new reactor designs that use thorium. And thorium, there's 10,000 years of mineable thorium just on the surface of the Earth's crust. We don't have that available in any of the fossil fuels. From a carbon footprint for a wind energy. So carbon footprint from wind energy seems like it's a zero carbon emitting item. But when you look at a lot of the rare earth metals and a lot of the material that's got to be used in even the fabrication of those items, it's not a completely clean carbon footprint. So when you talk carbon footprint, your first is how much is the plant emitting? a nuclear power plant emits zero carbon. There's nothing burning. You're not, and that was the whole point of how the fission process works and the heat. There's nothing burning. So if there's not burning, there's no carbon to be given off. Carbon's not even involved in the fission process. So we're not even talking about that. The second part of it is you have to think about is what is the overall carbon footprint for the manufacturing. And still, once a nuclear plant is built, whatever carbon footprint might have existed from the mining process has already been taken into account. And over the 50, 60, 70-year operating of that plant, that carbon footprint becomes pretty much negligible in comparison to even building a wind farm.
Well, what's interesting too is there's a 2013 NASA study that showed that nuclear energy actually prevented an average of 1.8 million air pollution-related deaths between 1971 and 2009, and NASA recommended greatly expanding nuclear energy. So, I mean, if you look at how, generally speaking, clean it is, and it appears to be fairly clean, is this a good source of energy to use in order to combat the effects of climate change?
Well, it's so this is where you get into to a really a real weird part of the discussion on nuclear energy. Recent studies that have actually been done, most of it over in Europe, especially post Fukushima, what they really focused on is countries that have higher than average wages, countries that are dealing with higher, that have higher levels of environmental concerns, i.e. your post-materialistic society and stuff. You would think that those would be the countries that would be to some extent more pro-nuclear. And what's actually been shown is that those countries are less nuclear. They have less trust in the savior side of nuclear power. All they see again is the potential that something bad could happen, such as a Chernobyl, and what that effect would be. So, you're to your argument. I mean, you're to basically get people to look at how nuclear power could help with climate change, could take the NASA study and go, look, you could effectively reduce, millions upon millions of tons of CO2 emission a year by moving towards a nuclear world. Unfortunately, we're actually moving into a societal model that actually downplays. I mean, in the United States, we are, even from the right side of the world, the left side is always pretty much seen as being anti-nuclear. Even the right side of the world, because wages are good, because we're seeing that we're trying to have a shift towards environmental protection. Believe it or not, that actually hurts the argument, and that was something that was weird and unexpected in the findings that were done in the European study.
Well, is there a way to get the public on board with nuclear power? Because, I mean, back in the 50s, 60s, your friend the atom, all that. But now a lot of people are, especially in the last 40 years or so, have gone very much anti-nuclear.
So there's two sides to that. There's two things that I think are the primary. One is education. The education that most of us got, most of the families back in the 50s and 60s got were the duck and cover. People were thinking more about, the ideas of a nuclear bomb. I mean, even one of the original founders of Greenpeace left Greenpeace because of their anti-nuclear power stance. He didn't recognize, even when they started Greenpeace, there was a difference between a nuclear reactor and a nuclear bomb. Nuclear reactors, there's not been a single nuclear accident that ever has actually resulted from a reactor exploding. There's no such thing as a nuclear reactor blowing up like a bomb. Even Chernobyl was a steam explosion. It was all of the heat that was generated because of the uncontrolled fission created a big massive immediate flash of steam. That's what actually blew the lid off of that thing and exposed the core. Bad design, right? That can be done. But so part of it you get into is education. We've not really taken the time, and at this point, if you start trying to educate now, one of the, another study actually looked at NGOs, non-governmental organizations, trying to do training, and you're basically, that defines it as, your for-profit, power producing companies. There is less trust in NGOs talking about the safety of nuclear power. So an NGO taking on an educational campaign will actually yield a more negative result in the acceptance of nuclear power. This is where they've shown that governmental organizations, the actual government itself, and it taking on a policy of trying to educate the public on the safety of nuclear power and on the environmental cleanliness and concerns and stuff, actually play a stronger role. But where that tipping point comes in is that in order for that to work, trust has to play into it. And again, as we said, NGOs, there's less trust in NGOs because immediate thought is they're for profit. So therefore, anything they tell us is just to improve their bottom line. If the people don't have a trust in their government at the time either, they're not going to have. So really, you're playing in a trust and a knowledge, and they both revolve around each other. And right now,
and a lot of people don't.
We can argue about how
exactly.
how people think about the government right now.
Well, a lot of people, don't trust NGOs, and a lot of people don't trust the government. So
and that's exactly
a big problem.
And because of that, what you see is that usually more developed countries are starting to move away from nuclear energy because of less trust in the government, less trust in NGOs and how they're approaching it. And a lot of your smaller, more developing countries actually have a little higher because they see, they either trust their government more or they see that they're looking out for their best interests, and and you can argue with how that wants to play, but it's really, we're dealing with this is a solvable problem when it comes to climate change and the introduction of nuclear energy. The problem is we started to step so far away that you're talking about starting to educate a whole new series of people starting now and to really accept it, and that could take decades.
Yeah. Well, to wrap this up, do you think that we should? How do you think we should go about building new nuclear power plants, expanding upon nuclear energy? Do you think that we should perhaps nationalize the industry, or should they be for profit, or should it be a little bit of both? What should we do about that?
Well, I think that you have to start with ensuring you have an open transparency about the entire nuclear process. You have to build that trust. Not only, inspection criteria. I mean, all of that's out there, but most people don't go look up nuclear inspections and stuff, right? I mean, it should be something that if you live within 100 miles of a nuclear power plant and that plant has an inspection, you should be sending a letter out to all the people. They're going, hey, this plant got inspected. Here's what they found. Again, initially it creates a problem because people are, oh, wait a minute, they just found this problem. Oh my, and it may be a benign problem. But it's still a point. You have to start with transparency. Anything that's part of the educational, that's part of the knowledge, right? Knowledge is not just how the reactor works and what the effects of radiation are, but what's happening in that plant at the same time. But then, as we spoke about with trust, and we spoke about with how knowledge works, there is, in my opinion, there needs to be some level of nationalization of nuclear energy. Either be it from a build and turnover process, i.e. the government builds it, provides all this backing, and maybe a private or maybe an NGO runs it for the government. Kind of how, and that's similar to how the nuclear Navy works, where you got a government and all the taxpayers paying for the reactor, but then we have a secondary company that we've hired that helps us with our designs, that helps us with our day-to-day changes and planning. And it's been an extremely successful. I mean, the Navy operates over 110 nuclear power plants. Some of these sitting in the middle of cities that wouldn't allow nuclear power plants to even start up anywhere near them. I mean, San Onofre in California is a prime example where they closed it down, but yet sitting in San Diego Harbor, there were 17 nuclear reactors all operating, and people are just driving around downtown San Diego with no thought in the world. So there has to be some level of how that trust is built, and in this instance, governmental action is going to have give stronger trust and confidence to the general public.
It's going to be needed for this.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Russell, thank you very much for giving us your insights. I really appreciate it. And I think there's a lot to be done in the field of nuclear, but we can just see where it goes from here.
Thanks, Alex.